definitely not going to happen tonight, so don't worry about that. How we going?
You can
Cool.
record, yes,
Daniel,
but I don't know if the recording was working. It was very strange. It was very strange.
we good? Well, kia ora, we're on. Welcome everybody to the Ask Me Why I'm Angry Welfare Disability Focused panel held with VUSA and the DSA. My name is Michael Turnbull. I'm going to be the MC for tonight. I'm the Welfare Vice President here on VUSA, and I'm really, really excited to ask our fantastic panelists some awesome questions. So I will pass the mic over very quickly to Sophie, who's going to give you a rundown about what she does on the DSA.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Sophie and I am on the exec of the DSA along with Alice and Connor and Tara. So the DSA is pretty much set up to advocate for and with students with impairments like mental health issues, disabilities and chronic illness. So we are obviously very invested in these issues because they really affect the students that we work with. Which is why we wanted to help out with hosting this panel. Yeah.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Sophie. Cheers for that. Sophie's also going to be in the crowd with a mic going around and giving you guys the opportunity to ask some questions when we have some crowd question breaks. So the way that we're going to run this panel is we're going to be asking questions to our panelists, and we'll have some breaks in between where you guys can just fire off, and the people online can also hopefully send through some questions, and we can get some really cool answers from our panelists and have some great conversations going. So today we have 4 fantastic panelists. We have Jonathan Boston, Tara O'Connor, Tara Sullivan, Kate Aschoff and Erin Goh. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Because this panel is all about personal experience and lived experience, I thought I would leave it to each of the panelists to give their own introduction so they can give you a really robust kind of understanding about what they do and who they are. So please go ahead, starting with you, Jonathan.
Okay, well, thank you for organising this, and it's great to be here. I'm called Jonathan Boston, and I teach in the School of Government here at Victoria University. I've been here for 32 years, so I'm now bringing up the average age, I think, of the audience. Just by way of personal experience, I guess disability, I'm in some ways a user, and in some ways, if you like, a writer about these things. So just from a personal point of view, I was brought up in a relatively privileged environment. My dad was a doctor who actually moved into psychiatry and had a substantial income. But when I was 9 years old, the family lost everything financially, and we ended up renting a house and living in what was, in those days, relatively poor circumstances. So, we didn't have any curtains, we didn't have any carpets, we had deck chairs for our lounge furniture, and I experienced something of the shame of that, and also the insecurity of having so little. So as a child, I moved from being well off to being relatively poor. Certainly not perhaps by global standards, but by New Zealand standards. So I know something of that. And then from a health perspective, I've had health issues since I was a baby. And I'm on permanent medication for a number of conditions, which includes an anxiety disorder. So I do very much identify with people who have mental health struggles, whether it's depression or anxiety, or if you like, more serious conditions, schizophrenia and so forth. So that's a sort of personal background. And then just quickly, as an academic, I've written about the welfare state, I've written about poverty issues. 8 years ago, I was asked by the Children's Commissioner, for whom Erin now works, to co-chair an expert advisory group on solutions to child poverty in New Zealand. And we spent the best part of 2012 writing lots of reports, and that ended up producing a document with about 78 recommendations. And I'm pleased to say that most of those recommendations have now actually been implemented, initially by the then national government and now by the Labour government. And perhaps the most significant recommendation we made in some respects was to require the passage of legislation in the form of a Child Poverty Reduction Act, which requires governments to set targets to reduce child poverty, monitor their performance, and so forth. And I had the privilege of helping to write that legislation when Jacinda became Prime Minister back in October 2017. So that's quickly my background, and very happy to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Kia ora, I'm Tara. I am an exec member for the Disabled Students Association, and I speak today predominantly as a consumer of mental health services. So I'm a mature student here. I study public policy and human resources, but I have been in the mental health system since I was 15, starting off with child, adolescent, family services, moved on to Wellington South Community Mental Health Team, and I've had a lot of experience with the mental health crisis team and the police. And then later on, I spent 14 months as an inpatient in the Ashburn Psychiatric Clinic in Dunedin. So I've started talking more about these things, and I have major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, which I talk a lot more about now because borderline personality especially is very highly stigmatized, within the mental health community. A lot of psychiatrists, therapists, mental health staff won't see us, they don't treat borderline patients. So it's something that I've recently started talking about, and I'll talk a bit about my experiences throughout the chat.
Great.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Kate toku ingoa, e noho ana au ki te whanganui atara, ko tēnei toku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua Aotearoa nei, nō reira tēnei koutou katoa. My name is Kate Aschoff. I'm from Wellington, and similarly to others on this panel, have also been through our DHB mental health systems, through our student health mental health systems here at Vic, and through private mental health services as well. Have also had to use the welfare system for the past 2 years, and have kind of experienced a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today around disability and mental illness, and engaging with these kind of systems of government that kind of write you off and don't necessarily give people like the holistic, well-rounded support that they need to thrive and do well. Professionally, I've for the last year or so sat on 2 governance boards. One of them is the Piki Service Users and Piki Youth Advisory Group, so that's for the mental health pilot that kind of came out of a confidence and supply agreement, and so I've been advising on that a little bit, and I've also written about my experiences with mental health in university and work in income publicly the last couple of years. Yeah, thank you.
Kia ora tātou everyone, ko Erin Goff taku ingoa. My name is Erin, and I'm a disability activist first and foremost. I have been disabled since birth and also have some experience of mental health and anxiety and some less visible chronic illness conditions as well. I guess in terms of my experience, similar to the panel, it's a mix of professional and personal. So I was on the supported living payments from when I was about 16 till I started working full time in 2015. So I had some experience of dealing with the welfare system, and I also have a law background and started out working for Community Law Canterbury. So I did some kind of beneficiary advocacy there, helping people navigate the welfare system and do benefit appeals and things like that. And then I moved to Wellington from Christchurch in 2015 to take up a role at the Human Rights Commission, and from there kind of been involved in policy and advocacy roles, done some work at the Ministry of Education, and now I'm at the Office of the Children's Commissioner as a senior advisor, providing advice mostly to government on how to take children's rights, interests and welfare into account, including reducing child poverty and addressing issues in the welfare system. I should just say, as a public servant in the election period that I'm mostly here to speak from a personal capacity, but obviously very happy to share my experience as part of my role at OCC as well. So thank you.
Good. Thank you so much to all our panelists for introducing themselves. That was really, really great to have a bit more information about you. Can we hear some noise for our amazing panelists? Thank you so much. That's it. They can hear all 100 of you who are here right now on the live stream. That's fantastic. Cool. Wicked. So before we continue, there's just a couple points of clarification I'd like to put out. So when we're talking about welfare on this panel, we're talking about areas of well-being. So the language that we're using when we talk about welfare is relevant to well-being, health, mental health, that sort of area. Another thing that we'd really like to outline and put out is that this is a safe space. If at any time you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to come talk to our lovely Grace and Ralph down the back there. We'll be more than happy to help you out, or you're more than welcome to leave anytime you feel uncomfortable. So just like to clarify that before we get started. Sweet. So without further ado, we'll get right into some questions. So the first question we have is one that we'd like to address firstly to all of you, but I thought perhaps it would be good for Tara to start with. Is what was your experience of wellbeing support in the tertiary education?
So it's actually been quite mixed. My first year at Vic, you didn't have your own GP at Student Health, and that's something that they've changed recently. So it was awful because I'm on a lot of medications. A lot of the medications I'm on are ones that sometimes they don't like to prescribe you if they don't know you that well, sort of thing. And that was just the start of it, but also telling a doctor that I've never met before my story every single time I went in to get a prescription, or if I'd want them to refer me to the mental health team or anything like that. So I'm glad that that's changed. However, there's a huge issue with wait times at Student Health. I'm sure if any of you use Student Health, you're aware. And typically I would wait probably 3 weeks to see someone, which is terrible, especially for any student, not only students with a mental or physical disability, but for anyone to have to wait 3 weeks if you're not feeling great, and you'll have an assignment during that time. So that definitely needs to change. One good thing that the university has done is I'm in a group called Wise Minds, which is run by the university. It's a dialectical behaviour therapy group, which dialectical behaviour therapy is specifically for people who struggle with emotional regulation, and it's something that's really hard to get into publicly because you end up on a waiting list for like a year or 18 months. That's if you can even get on the waiting list, because you've got to be what they consider high risk, which is just, I think, kind of arbitrary anyway. But yeah, the university have started doing a Wise Minds group, which I was really surprised about and really pleased about, because it's not something that I've heard of other universities doing. A lot of universities will do, like I've studied at Canterbury as well, and they did things like sleep classes to teach you how to do your sleep hygiene, and that's all great. But actually having the dialectical behaviour therapy, where it's 9 weeks, you're in a group with, I think there's about 12 of us, and it's 2 hours every Monday, and we talk through everything we learn, and everyone shares their experiences, has been fantastic. And I think if the university can do more group therapy or group programs like that would actually be really beneficial, because you learn from others, and it's so nice to be in a room with people who understand my situation as well. Yeah, I think that's what I've written on my notes.
Thanks so much, Tara. Kate, would you like to?
Yeah, so yeah, like I said before, I've also used VUW Student Health Services back in 2017, which was my first year of university, and I'd accessed both private and public mental health services prior to coming to university, so already had a bit of history of mental distress, and so I don't know, I can't remember if I had a super long wait time, but I know I did end up going to see someone eventually there because I was struggling to keep up with my reading and feeling really overwhelmed in first year, you know, not knowing anyone, all the kind of normal stuff that happens. And I saw someone there, I think for about 6 months, probably only once a month, but I found that it was good, but it wasn't the kind of support that I needed. And kind of through that, I did a bit of work with Salient around, I'm not sure if Gerard Goffman is still leading student health here or not. I think, no? He's moved on, but we did an interview with him kind of around like what, from the practitioner perspective, like the purpose of student health is. And I think my kind of analysis of it is like because they're dealing with kind of the over kind of like the DHBs, you know, can't take people and people can't go private, so they go to their student health facilities because they think that, okay, I'm experiencing mental distress, like these people are here and they're meant to help me, but a lot of their stuff is like really low level basic stuff. It's about helping students get an agri-tech or helping them through an emotional situation they might be in, but it's not a lot of like long-term kind of support. So I'm really glad to hear that they're doing a DBT group because I've done similar therapies and it's really effective. So I think a lot of it kind of comes down to, I guess, just like capacity and funding, right? Like what the university sees the purpose of student health is versus what it is being accessed as, which is often like crisis services and other things like that, because students literally do not have anywhere else to go. And I think it becomes a really difficult situation where, you know, if you don't have anywhere else to go and then you can't go to student health and you get missed, right? And you fall through those cracks and, you know, you like me, I had to leave university because my health was just in such a not a good place and I didn't have the support services I needed to kind of continue with my studies at the time. I think there's a lot that can be kind of expanded in that space and how we look at mental health within this institution, especially with so many young people and so much happening in our world that affects our distress while we're here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. Aaron, would you like to?
Sure. I went to Canterbury. I graduated in 2014, so a few years ago now, but the main supports that I got that I remember were mostly through things like getting note takers or exam accommodations. So again, they were very kind of one-off, really helpful things, but not very holistic. And one of the main barriers that I faced was getting around campus was really hard in terms of access, in terms of like actually getting in and out of some of the lecture theatres that we were in. Unlike now with COVID and some of the kind of more flexible learning options that have been made available, there wasn't that as an option or any kind of real effort to look into that as an option. So a lot of it was around having to overcome those physical access barriers. And then I think as well the other kind of barrier was that there wasn't really any kind of acknowledgement or recognition about the impact of ableism or ableism in the academic environment. And some of the, even though I was taking, you know, sociology courses and things like that, there wasn't really that conversation that was being had in any kind of meaningful way. And I think that would have been really helpful as more of a framework for the university to actually acknowledge that ableism as a concept actually exists for one and has an impact on your experience as a university student.
Kia ora, thank you, Aaron. Jonathan.
So, look, this is a vast topic, and I really appreciated just hearing what the others have said. If I would just make a few quick comments, kind of from the inside out, if I can put it this way. So, first of all, kind of as a user, as a student 40-something years ago, at Canterbury University, I made use of the student health services, which was great. But I also had a father who was a doctor, so he prescribed for me as well, which he probably shouldn't, but that's life. And he's dead now, so he can't be prosecuted. And then, well, my wife is a doctor, though she's retired now, but she trained in psychiatry as well, and somehow managed to marry me despite my proclivities. So she's been on my journey of life with the challenges that I've had. I've been very fortunate because of having both a father and a wife as medics. That has been enormously helpful from multiple points of view, including being able to afford to go to psychiatrists privately, which is something that I think you mentioned, Kate. And I've had two psychiatrists, one of whom was really fantastic. I won't mention names, but it was a tremendous blessing for me, and basically took an experimental approach to things, which was to say, well, let's see what might work. And I basically signed a consent form which said he could experiment on me, and we went through a whole battery of drugs, some of which were dreadful in their effects, and finally we found something which seemed to work for me, and I've been on that medication for 16 years continuously. So that's just a little sort of personal element. Now, can I put it looking from the outside as an academic in this institution, but also in a context where my wife worked as a medic at the Massey Health Services for about 5 years. So I sort of saw things from a Massey perspective as well. Look, the fundamental problem is there is an acute shortage of healthcare specialists and resources in a context where there's been bluntly an explosion in need and demand, and COVID has intensified that. Teaching this year at this university, I've just been really conscious of just how many students have been stressed, anxious, probably mildly and sometimes more seriously depressed. I've never witnessed anything like it, Michael, and I've had students emailing me, large numbers of students emailing me about their anxiety issues. Sometimes the subject line simply says help. And so looking at it from a staff perspective, I'm just very conscious of the need, and of course the need among some of my colleagues as well, not just the students. So if we then just quickly go to the sort of public policy side of this, yes, this government has announced some initiatives in mental health with additional expenditure and additional services of various kinds, and some of those, like the ones you've been involved in, are great initiatives. But we're going to need a lot more, and we're going to have to do a lot more at what might be called the low-level sort of side of things, so that for many people, they don't end up becoming more seriously afflicted. And I think if the COVID situation continues as it looks likely to for another 6 months or a year or possibly longer, I think universities like Victoria really will need to run lots of the sorts of programs that you were talking about, Tara. I've probably said enough, but there's just a fundamental issue of scarce capability, a need for much greater investment, and a need to be really smart about what we do and how we do it.
Excellent. Thank you all for sharing that. I think, Jonathan, you started to touch on, I think, actually really great. You're helping me with my segues already. So the next question we have up is kind of how do you think, what changes do you think need to be brought to kind of, in terms of ensuring either at the university or the government level, what changes would you bring in to ensure that universities are adequately equipped to deal with mental illness, chronic illness, and disabilities in a better light? So Jonathan, maybe if you were touching on that, if you wanted to start, and then we can move down the panel.
Big topic, and there's folk to my left that know more about this from a practical point of view, but I suppose the things I would emphasize is, first of all, we'll need additional public investment, probably on a pretty substantial scale, and that's for services, but also I think for student support. So I'm really concerned about the financial pressure that many students are under at present. COVID is only making that worse. We've got enormous problems in the housing market here in Wellington, and of course in Auckland as well, but also some other centres. So I think we need a kind of a package of initiatives that would include, the greater investment in mental health services alongside some additional financial support for students, but also for essentially most people, if not all people, on welfare benefits. We do not have a generous benefit system in this country, and we need to enhance the income support that we provide pretty well to all people on benefits. Disability assistance in form of the child disability allowance, the disability allowance, and the special disability allowance, they're all relatively meagre, frankly, certainly by some European standards, and they need to be increased. And I think reducing financial stress is at least one way to try and reduce mental health stress. It's not the only thing, of course, but it would help. And then just going back to what I said before, Michael, I think the university needs to institute pretty regular and comprehensive programs in stress management. I mean, just simple techniques, breathing exercises, relaxation exercises, sleep hygiene, those sorts of things, as well as obviously, issues that relate to drugs and so forth. And this needs to be kind of normalized, and maybe we need to almost require every student to do, a couple of weeks of this, during their first year at university or something. But just so that this is just taken as a kind of a normal, regular service that is for everyone, not just for people who are on the brink. Anyway, that's enough.
I'd say very similarly what you were just talking about with making these things more accessible to students, because, for example, the Wise Minds group I'm doing, that's something that my GP referred me to, and I would imagine most people have no idea it exists unless their GP has referred them to the group. So there'll be people likely who are struggling with emotion regulation and just firstly don't know it's there, and secondly, because it hasn't been advertised, there hasn't been a way for them to talk about it or bring it up, and maybe they think they're the only one struggling with that. So I think if it was more widely known that these things are happening behind the scenes, like Wise Minds, or if they're going to do sleep class, the sleep hygiene classes and things like that, that would be fantastic. And I suppose the same goes for the government. It's really tricky to navigate mental health services in New Zealand, health services in general in New Zealand. It's like I'll get sent somewhere and they only know what they know. They don't know about any other services around them. So you go there and they say, oh, we can't help you, and then that's where it ends. And then you go back to your GP and your GP goes, oh, okay. Or they know somewhere, so they'll send you somewhere else. So that needs to be a heck of a lot clearer, and they need to be communicating with each other. And definitely funding. Funding's a massive issue ever since the mother of all budgets in the 90s, and they cut funding to heaps of mental health services. So yeah, it is going to cost a lot, and there's no way around it, I feel.
I think, I definitely agree with Jonathan and Tara around that we need more funding of our public services and more investment in that. We need more investment in how we manage and talk about mental health within universities. But I think also going even further on that, I think we need, at least, to change the way that universities run, as institutions, and the kind of culture within them around just how much work you have to be doing and having to turn up to certain classes and having to hand things in at certain times, and just this culture of success and doing better, and what doing good looks like and what doesn't look like, and all the extracurriculars you feel you have to do, and just kind of this kind of bigger, wider way that society looks at universities as these places of learning, but I felt while I was here I didn't learn anything because I was so overwhelmed with just the pressure cooker that is being in this environment with other people who are also feeling exactly the same way but have no outlet of talking to each other about it or communicating on it. I don't know what these big university institutional culture changes look like yet, but I think conversations like this can kind of slowly lead us toward them, hopefully.
Yeah, I tautoko everything that Tara, Jonathan and Kate have said. I guess from a children's perspective, I would also say that we need to invest in kind of well-being a lot earlier. I know that when I worked at the Ministry of Education, we were doing a lot of work around the role of school counsellors, and we saw a lot of primary school students, for example, who needed mental health and wellbeing support that weren't able to get it just because there wasn't that system in place. So I think if we invested in mental health and other kind of disability supports throughout the education system, I think that would be really helpful as well. And obviously the tertiary education system is an important part of that, but I'd hope by investing earlier that by the time people get to uni, they actually have had the support prior to getting to this point. And I agree with Kate that there does need to be some kind of broader, more institutional overhaul of academia in general, and just in terms of even the diversity of academics who are hired and who gets to be an academic is a massive issue when it comes to obviously racism and ableism and all those kinds of discriminations and oppressions as well. So I think that's something that we also need to look at just as a start.
Thank you, and I think that last point, especially that you raised around the kind of intersectionality of the academic space, is a really important part, and that's why this next question we have is, how are the communities at the intersections between race, class, and disability impacted differently by our welfare system? So feel free to start, Jonathan.
Oh, that's a huge
It's
one.
a big question.
Oh, well, I mean, the first thing one has to be mindful of in New Zealand is that we have very significant racial inequality and in gender inequality, and disabled people are also, generally speaking, much poorer and have fewer assets than people without significant disabilities. You had some figures up on the screen. So one of the students I had a few years ago is a person called Sam Murray. Sam works for CCS Disabilities Services, and he's written a number of articles on the levels of poverty among disabled people, including disabled children. And so we have some significant issues there, Michael, that really do need to be addressed. Some of them can be addressed relatively simply if we were prepared to tax some of us a bit more, like me, and redistribute a bit more. It would actually be quite simple, but politically extremely difficult. Some issues are going to require probably generations to address. I think addressing the enormous challenge of ethnic inequality in this country is going to be another several generations, simply because of the complexity of the issues and the changes that are required. I mean, just to take home ownership, for example, home ownership rates for Pakeha are in the vicinity of probably around 70%, for Māori around 40%, for Pacifica 30% or less, and that's a huge issue, and it's a huge inequality. It means the overwhelming majority of Pacifica and the clear majority of Māori are not going to be passing on an asset to their children. So really big issues, and addressing that housing problem, housing inequality, cost of housing, poor quality housing. I mean, that will take a concerted effort for at least a generation, if we could sustain it. And my concern is that I don't think politically it will be easy to sustain. So huge issues, big challenges. We do have policy levers that can make a difference. It's the politics of it that's the really hard bit.
So I can really only speak to my experience, but the inequalities, the reason I started speaking actually because, so my parents are wealthy, and that's one of the reasons, in fact it's really the only reason I believe that I'm able to talk about this now the way I can. So when I was hospitalized for my borderline personality disorder at the Ashburn Clinic, there's a few ways you can get in there. There's the DHB, they have beds, Ministry of Health have beds, Eating Disorder Services, and then there's also a way in through the prison system. It's sort of, some people are offered beds there instead of in prison if it's deemed that their mental health has caused their actions. Or you can go privately, which is how I got in, and I was there for 14 months and it cost my parents $130,000. And I remember saying to my psychiatrist at the time, maybe I'd been there a month or two, and I hated it because no one, we're all grumpy, we don't want to be there, we're all very upset, obviously. And I said to her, if I can't get funding from the DHB or the ministry, maybe I just don't need to be here. And she said, look, in 10 years, if you're still alive and you're not in prison, you'll get funding, I guarantee it. And so I stayed, and that was really an eye-opener into what it's like for people who don't have a parent who can spend $130,000 on their health, because that's a very grim view of how the future could turn out. So yeah, I've done really well, and I still will require healthcare for the rest of my life. And as I've gotten older as well, I've become more worried about this, because eventually my dad's going to pass away one day, and I will likely need help into my 60s and 70s, and dad won't be there. And so I started trying to navigate the mental health system and was just absolutely shocked at it, because it feels like there's no one tells you where you're going. It's like you go, like I said, I go to the GP and they go, here, we're going to send you to community mental health, and then they say, oh no, we can't help you, and that's it. And there's clearly I needed help, and clearly there were places that could help, but they just said, no, we can't help you, and we're not going to bother telling you other places that could help, or the other routes, or anything like that. So yeah, I do feel like I do have a responsibility to talk about this, because a lot of the people I was in the Ashburn Clinic with were in their 40s and 50s, or had been through, had really rough lives, and they had to wait a long time to get that treatment. So there's definitely a class issue. Absolutely, there's a class issue there. And there's obviously with class comes issue of race and all these other things. So yeah, it's me.
I only have a few things to kind of say on this one. I think, again, agree with everything that has kind of been covered. But I think in terms of when we talk about the intersections of whether it be race, class, disability, identity, I think we know that, these are people's real life experiences, and there's always going to be intersections between what they're experiencing and whatever systems they're engaging in, right? It's not, the same for me engaging in things as it is for my Māori mates or my differently disabled mates, and that kind of I think it's my kind of thing that I always struggle with is that we kind of talk about we need more funding, we need more access, we need this, but also we don't really change the level of comprehension of these support systems. I've done a lot of work with Rainbow young people, especially here in Wellington, and the kind of mental health support services they need is very different to what a young cisgendered straight kid might need. And I think it's very similar for disabled communities, for Māori communities, like, you know, it definitely a lot of the time will come back to access whether you can actually get yourself in the room, but also once you're in the room, the kind of comprehension of the support that is being offered to you really varies so dramatically, even within the private sector, I think, as well. So I think, yeah, more kind of community-led approaches to mental health services and support is really vital in helping people thrive and kind of get, like, I guess the appropriate kind of support that actually meets them where they're at, rather than kind of getting them to put down parts of themselves when they enter that room. Yeah.
Yeah, kia ora. Yeah, I guess just want to share two examples that this question made me think of. One was with my experience of WINS as a Pākehā person navigating that system, not having the extra burden of being racially profiled or discriminated against in any way, and second of all, having a law background and being able to navigate that complex system made it so much easier to actually deal with that system. So, for example, I had a couple of experiences where I was really badly treated by WINS, and I was just sick of having to go in and constantly have to fight to be, like, paid, basically. And so I got so sick of it that I decided that I would write to the minister at the time, and I did. And as a young uppity law student, I could, like, phrase my letter well and cite sections of the Social Security Act and give them an idea of what my rights were. And I got a response a couple of months later, and my treatment from there on was just so much different by the WINS office that I was dealing with, because obviously they knew that I was willing to advocate so strongly for myself, and they knew that I knew how to navigate the system. But there would be so many people that didn't have that privilege in terms of knowing how to advocate for yourself, and then on top of that have to deal with, for example, racism as well. So I'm very conscious of that, especially as a Pākehā disabled person that does carry privilege that non-Pākehā disabled people don't have in these sorts of systems. And then the other story that made me think of when Kate was talking was often when I've dealt with mental health systems in particular, a lot of therapists or doctors or medical professionals in general tend to blame the kind of mental health issues that I'm dealing with on my disability. Like, they're like, oh well, of course you're feeling like this, you're disabled, like, your life's pretty shit, and it's just that kind of, like, lack of acknowledgement of the role of, like, systemic oppression in terms of making people feel this way, and again the impact of ableism in terms of that on people's health in general, and the fact that actually it's not me or my body that's the problem, it's the barriers that society kind of has presented that I constantly have to overcome, that kind of exacerbates all these issues. And you can tell me to be mindful and to do breathing exercises as much as you want, but you can't breathe your way out of systemic oppression.
That's a quote to end on. I love that. That's great. Thank you so much. Cheers. Okay, cool. So thank you for that, guys. Cheers for that. So we now have some time for questions from the crowd. So is there anybody who would like to ask a question to our amazing panelists? Don't be shy. Sweet.
Hello. We touched on it briefly, John, about the increase in the need for mental health services during the pandemic. And I thought a lot about how the material conditions are changing for people, and in fact thinking about climate change, there's a lot to be nervous about and depressed about, frankly. The sort of capitalist realism has to play into how we think about, well, we are going to need to increase funding, but then also trying to imagine a system that could provide better for the people. And I was kind of wondering, outside of our current system, if you were to design a society for everyone, a truly inclusive society, what kind of things you'd start to think about?
Whoa. This is the utopian question, is it? What would my utopia look like? Oh my gosh. It's a very good question. Can I just, first of all, acknowledge your point about climate change and indeed the wider ecological crises we face, biodiversity loss and so on and so on. It can be very oppressive. And I've been working on climate change issues for 15 years or so as an academic, and I sometimes feel very, very downcast about it. You know, every so often you get some positive information. For example, the Chinese president announced today that China will become carbon neutral by 2060. First time. I mean, this is really quite significant, but it's 10 to 20 years too late. But it's a step in the right direction. In very broad terms, the kind of society I would wish to advocate for, and indeed I guess I do, is one that is fundamentally sustainable ecologically. So that means we have to live within the biophysical parameters of the planet and the biophysical parameters that operate at multiple spatial levels, so regional, local, etc., for catchments, for whatever. And that means we're going to have to change the way we live quite radically. Then in terms of, if you like, issues of social justice and inclusion, well, I've written a little book which I brought along called Transforming the Welfare State Towards a New Social Contract in New Zealand. And basically, I think we need to make some pretty fundamental changes to our welfare state. The reformers of the late 19th century who introduced a pension for people, and then the reformers of the first Labour government in this country, laid some very good foundations, but those foundations are not adequate for the challenges we face now. And those challenges are not just ecological and inequality related and so on, but also technological. We're in the midst of a massive technological revolution, which is going to have profound and totally uncertain consequences. It will almost certainly affect a lot of the kind of work that you folk will do. I'll be retired, but it will affect how we live, and obviously already is. So I think we're going to need to really revisit how we think about the relationship between paid employment and lifelong education and income support for people to retrain, to be re-educated, and so on. And we need, in my view, a much more egalitarian society in which the gaps between the rich and the poor in terms of income and wealth are radically reduced. The challenge is how to get there. So that would be among my starting points. There's lots and lots of other things, but that's probably enough. Can I tell a joke? Just when I was listening to Tara about $130,000. I mean, yes, I've paid psychiatrists quite a lot of money, but not $130,000. But I was reminded of the person who rang the psychiatrist's office to get an appointment. This is a private, and said, look, I really need to see Dada, and how much will it cost me? And the receptionist said, well, $700 for the first appointment, and then $500 for each other one. And the person at the other end of the phone says, gee, I'm not that mad. Put the phone down. Sorry. Sorry. It's just a joke, right?
Sweet. Bit of comic relief for you there.
Sorry.
So, we probably have time for one more question from the crowd.
And not for me, please.
Okay. Yeah, well, this is Erin, but I think you're probably, anyone. It's a bit of a policy question, but I think New Zealand has a bit of a collective memory, collective forgetful memory, I should say, of that we're a very, egalitarian society from the start. Which is obviously not true. And I think it's up there So I made the slide, so if it's not obvious, but yeah, so between the 1950s and 90s, for instance, New Zealand institutionalised people 3 times the rate of other countries similar. So that's, we all know that disabled people, especially learning disabled people and people with psychiatric conditions, are also Māori children. Yeah, and so, you know, we're still seeing the human rights inquiries into that to this day. And I wonder whether, it's a very, very like high level sort of question, but is there, do you think, a historical connection between that sort of past of our welfare system and today, and that the, you know, the welfare system has always been flawed, and is there, do you see a connection there, and why maybe that is the case, like in our society specifically? Obviously colonization is a big issue, but yeah, that's, and also on top of that, sorry, like how we have all that history, and so obviously how do you think that acknowledging that history is going to be important in terms of actually like creating material change for those communities going forward? Sorry, it's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I could just put some high-level thoughts forward. The first thing is, it's unfortunately not just historical either. Like, we have deinstitutionalized on a big scale, and people have kind of gone from being in these large-scale institutions into the community. But if you look at things like small group homes and residential special schools, for example, these are still very much segregated settings with the same kind of principle underlying them, which is that disabled people should be institutionalized. And actually, I saw an article the other day, about a week ago, of these 2 new houses that have been opened in, I think, the Hawke's Bay, specifically for disabled children, and it was framed as a positive thing, and that they were like fully accessible, and you know, they had all this you know, up to date equipment and all these things. But if you actually like think about that a bit more, it's still kind of the idea that you're taking disabled children away from their families and expecting them to live in this institutional setting. So I think we still unfortunately have that undercurrent of segregation, albeit on a smaller scale. And even if you look at employment, for example, people are always so shocked when you tell them about you know, these places that people work where they get paid less than minimum wage. Like, you know, that's actually illegal to pay people who work in kind of these sheltered workshops, effectively, that have been renamed to be a bit more palatable, as little as $2 an hour. You know, that's still a thing that happens today. So I think it just has kind of kept playing out in a different way, and I guess the Royal Commission of Inquiry will be one way that we can start to address these issues, hopefully, and the recommendations that come from that. And it's good to see that that's not just being limited to the distant past as it was in the beginning, and you can kind of see that the impacts, I guess, from these sorts of historical settings very much in the wellbeing data that we have, the limited amount that there is on disabled people. For example, the recent Household Labour Force survey, you see the employment stats are pretty dire, but also just like mental ill health among disabled people are significantly more likely to have mental ill health, to be discriminated against. Yeah, so there's still a long way to go, I'd say.
Sure, thank you. We're asking some very high-level questions, so we're solving all the issues New Zealand has tonight, and it's fantastic. Thank you so much. Cheers for the questions from the crowd. That was fantastic. So we'll move on to our next part, and we're going to get a little bit political. We've got the election coming up, which is quite exciting. So the next question that we've got for our panelists are, what are some key policies you're looking for this election? Maybe if Erin, you wanted to start this time?
Yeah, sure. So from a personal perspective, I think first and foremost, for me, the most important one would be a commitment to building accessible housing. Just like a little personal anecdote, like I do live in an accessible house now with a couple of other disabled friends, but the only reason it's accessible is because my flatmate's parents own it and made it that way. And before that, for a period last year, was having to actually shower at work for about 7 months because the bathroom of my apartment, I couldn't use the shower. And so that was, talking about mental ill health, that had a fairly significant impact on my health in general. So I think that would be the main one that I would like to see. And then I think also, as other people have talked about, a commitment to kind of overhauling the welfare system and taking a transformational approach to addressing poverty, so substantially raising benefit levels as a start, and really prioritising children as a group, I think would be a great start and a good investment in our future generations. And then a more specific one, I think, is a commitment to addressing the discrepancy between people who receive Ministry of Health support and people who receive ACC support. Just from a personal perspective, as someone who was born disabled, the level of support that I receive is significantly lower than someone who gets into an accident. Like, that's never really made any logical sense to me. And we've seen with the kind of discourse around the two-tier benefit system with the COVID response, there's actually been a two-tier kind of health response for the last 50 years that I would really like to see addressed. So just some small issues.
Yeah, I think similar to Erin, lots of really awesome things there. The things that I'm personally thinking about, obviously for students, especially something like a universal student allowance, which NZUSA and various other student unions have been campaigning on recently, especially through COVID. Again, raises to lifts to core benefit levels, the expansion of our mental health services, especially from like a te whare tapu whā model, like Māori kind of health focused, changes to our wages, lifting the minimum wage to like living wage. I think, there's so much stuff that I want to see. So
definitely the benefit system. Like, I've lived before on the sickness benefit back when we had it, and that's changed now, but it's bloody hard. Like, there's no room for anything. If you... I had to ask for my parents to help me get bus money just to go to the doctor on the sickness benefit. Was terrible. And there's nothing you can do when you're on a sickness benefit. There's no... Well, again, I think it's job seeker now that they put you on, but you can't work. So there's no... It just feels like a losing battle, really, like you're stuck there. Definitely housing as well, but specifically housing that's going to focus around the community, because we need... I'm a big fan of, like... So for mental health, they find that it's better, rather than putting people in separate areas and, like you were saying, kind of taking disabled people out of the community and putting them somewhere else. They find it's better if you can make the community more accessible for the people who are there. So with housing, that means ensuring that people can get places and have, like community centres where we can go and receive these services. And I suppose when it comes to mental health specifically, with funding, like the government's put a lot of money into things like, the counselling for under 25s and things like that, which is awesome, and I'm so glad that they've done it. But I can't use that for anything. And, I've aged out, but also what I would need is psychotherapy, and it would be for periods of 6 to 18 months, maybe every 5 or 10 years. So, it's really just, it feels almost like they focus on people right at the beginning, which you do need to, and it needs to be there. And then the people at the edge of the cliff, and we've got we've got our 11A wards in Wellington and stuff like that, but there's a big group of us in the middle who are just kind of keeping above water, and I'd really like to do better than that. Yeah.
Well, look, I've probably already said a bit about what I think needs to change, and I agree with almost everything that's been said by the others. Can I just go to a different level on this, though? You know, we are in the midst of an election. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. We're in the midst of ecological crises. You know, these are really serious matters, and these issues really take us to the heart of what it means to be a human being, and what our vision is for the future. As an individual, but also as a human family. And I would like to see in this election campaign some really serious debate about the values that need to underpin the kinds of solutions we need for a future that is sustainable and just and inclusive and so forth. So I'm concerned that the neoliberal revolution of the last 30 to 40 years has generated a set of attitudes and values that are inimical to doing what we need to do from a policy point of view. You know, we've had this enormous emphasis on individual freedom, on individual achievement, on people having a sense of entitlement to the fruits of their labour. So you mustn't tax people too much. You know, this is mine, and you mustn't put on a capital gains tax. You mustn't put on an inheritance tax. You mustn't put on an estate duty or anything like that, because all this is bad, because it's taking away from people what they deserve. This whole idea of sort of we merit it because we've worked hard. We've made a big contribution, you know, we've made a huge effort and so on. And I think we need to rebalance that with a much greater emphasis on a recognition of human interdependence, on human solidarity, on the notion of us being our brothers and sisters keepers and needing to support one another. And, you know, the Prime Minister's talked a lot about kindness. Totally agree. We do genuinely need to be kind, and what that means, of course, is that if you really do care for each other, including particularly those who are the least advantaged in your midst, then you're going to be willing to give up things. You're going to be willing to pay more tax. You're going to be willing to live a different life. You know, you're going to be willing to give up your SUV so you don't pollute the planet, and so on and so on. You're going to be able to give up your idea of constantly flying around the world and generating enormous carbon emissions. So I think we need fundamentally a revolution of the heart and the mind that will facilitate the capacity to make the kind of policy changes we need. How we bring about that, I don't entirely know, but it needs to be advocated. We need powerful advocacy for, you know, a different conception of how we need to run our society. And I think if we don't have that, to be honest, given the magnitude of the challenges we face, not least climate change and so on in the future, it's going to be extremely difficult to address those problems. If we don't come together, if we don't have a conception of the common good, social justice, interdependence and so on, well, we're going to end up simply killing each other, frankly. It's going to be a really, really brutal, nasty situation, and I'm afraid if you look at what's happening in the United States at the moment, you can kind of see something of that. People standing on their rights, you know, mustn't wear a mask, you know, they want their guns, etc., etc. It's a terrible, terrible prospect, but it's the fruit of this enormous emphasis on individualism and individual freedom and, you know, individual rights but no responsibilities and so on and so on. So there we go. Something a bit different, maybe.
Kia ora, cheers, thank you. Jonathan, thank you for that last point there. I think specifically the point about individualism versus looking communally at the benefit that we can give to society as a whole is a really important point. And I think that's something that has resonated throughout all the panelists tonight. So I'd like to ask the panelists, starting with Tara, what would be your key messages to voters this election?
Actually, I saw this really great quote that's been floating around online on a lot of the disability pages, and it's I've written it down because it's so good. it says, think of the most vulnerable person you know and vote in their best interest. And that's what I would say to people, because it's really easy to forget what's outside your own bubble. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Tara. I think the power is in thinking about not just yourself but other people, but also especially when it just comes to voting in general, like just having conversations with people. Like there's so many young people who don't vote, don't know why it affects them, don't know why they should care when, you know, it doesn't seem like anything in their lives are changing. So I would just encourage people to really just like have those difficult conversations with people, to like, you know, learn about new things, to talk with family members who you know, might not think climate change is real, or might not know how they feel about the cannabis referendum, or, you know, listening to disabled communities around the end-of-life choice bill. Yeah, I just think anything that is kind of prompting conversation before we do go to the polls. Obviously there's not a lot of time left, but I think that is always going to be a really valuable thing,
Yeah, I guess I would echo what Tara was saying. There's a similar quote, which is like, when you're not doing so well, vote for a better future for yourself. If you are doing well, then vote for a better future for others. So that sort of idea that, and what Jonathan was touching on about the need to have a collective sense of rights and responsibilities in a community sense, I suppose. And then, you know, in terms of like my role at OCC, like, it's very on brand for me to say, but like, think of the children. You know, there is a large proportion of children and people who at the moment can't vote, and who arguably should be able to. And I would just say, think of their interests as well leading into the future.
Well, I totally agree with what's been said. I mean, I'll just add one quick footnote, which is when the National Party announced its tax policy, I really just about wanted to vomit. I'm sorry. I mean, why on earth should you give someone like me another $100 a week? And what is it, $8 a week to someone on the minimum wage? And why should we be spending $5 billion mostly to give better off people some more money in a time of a crisis? I mean, I just found it almost unbelievable. I mean, it's only believable because of this powerful anti-tax individualism, you know, to hell with the poor kind of mentality that has dominated so much with thinking in the Western world, in particular in the last 30 or 40 years. And I just find it sickening. And it's sickening not just because of what it tells you about a mentality, but it's sickening because, I mean, a lot of people will probably be persuaded by. I'm sorry. I feel quite upset about it. I mean, it just needs to be called out. This is irresponsible, it's unjust, it's unfair, it's wrong. Right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
We're going to finish soon. I just need to get home for dinner.
No, fair enough. That's so fair, Jonathan. I'm so sorry. So we have one question specifically for you. So perhaps could we ask you that before you leave?
No, I'm being a bit naughty.
Okay. So as you can tell, political neutrality is out the window. Sweet. So we'll start with some individual questions to each of our panelists. Starting with Jonathan. So can you tell us a bit about the Living Standards Framework and what is its influence?
All right. In a nutshell, the Treasury developed the Living Standards Framework some 10 years ago. The idea was to move away from a single focus on gross domestic product, which is a measure of the flow of the value of goods and services in a society, and to have a broader measure of kind of what really matters, whether you want to call it well-being, living standards, welfare, whatever. And so the Treasury put quite a lot of effort into this. The then government, Bill English and John Key, took no interest in it whatsoever. But the Treasury persisted, and they developed a kind of model which gave some emphasis to particular policy objectives like sustainability and social cohesion and fiscal responsibility and so on, but also to what they called sort of capitals, of which there are about 4: natural capital, social capital, human capital, and financial and manufactured capital. And they said, look, the capitals are critical for long-term well-being, and these other goals are important kind of on maybe a shorter-term framework. And cutting right to the chase, the Living Standards Framework got very little traction with the former government, and then the Labour-led government took office in 2017 and said, actually, we want to focus on well-being as a broad objective, perhaps more specifically, collective intergenerational well-being over time, intergenerational well-being. So the Treasury then rethought its Living Standards Framework, and it's really now a well-being framework. So the basic point here is to have a broad conception of what matters, wide range of indicators, not to be fixated unduly on gross domestic product as an indicator of progress or society's well-being.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. So our next question is for Kate. And this is about the Piki pilot, which you've been working on for the last wee while. So do you think that the Piki pilot is a good solution? And can you tell us about the work that you have done on the youth income plan? So feel free to break those up into 2 little bits.
For sure. Yeah, I guess first of all, on the Piki pilot, I'm no longer affiliated, which I have to say for legal reasons, I don't know. But yeah, I think when we use the word solution, right, like we talk about mental health and we talk about like mental distress and access to services, we're like, oh, there has to be one solution, right, that will kind of like cover all and will kind of fix all these things, and then everyone will be great and it'll be fine. But I think the Piki pilot is, for those who don't know, it's a project that came out of the confidence and supply agreement between the Labour and the Greens. It's based on kind of preventative methods around preventing mental distress to get worse. It's kind of targeted at 18 to 25-year-olds, currently being piloted in the Wellington region, and it also mostly looks at like mild to moderate. So if you're more severe, they'll still refer you to DHB services. If you're in crisis, they'll refer you to DHB services or the crisis team or ED. They do face-to-face therapy, group therapy, peer support, and they also have an app. So there's a lot going on there. I think, I know a lot of people have accessed it, and I've read like a lot of the reports on it, and I think it's a really great step towards kind of like letting some of the stress off the DHB system and even off like student health systems that just didn't have capacity for this low-level stuff, so only more kind of severe cases were being seen. I think there's a lot of potential in the prevention space and a lot more work to do. Whether it goes far enough as a project on its own, I think it obviously needs to be expanded nationwide or something very similar. But I think also the consultation methods that are used within projects like this, whether it be with young people, disabled communities, Māori, Pacifica, I think that kind of aspect of it needs to be developed. And like kind of we've all kind of said that, you know, there's no one thing that will kind of make life better for people, right? It's also about making sure they have accessible housing, they have fair wages, they have, you know, all these other kind of things. Yeah, so in terms of Piki, that's that. And I guess in terms of the other thing you mentioned, Michael, the youth income plan, which is something I created on behalf of the Young Greens of Aotearoa, because obviously this, again, election year, and we really wanted to create our own policy platform by young people for young people about what we wanted to see from our governing parties, whether that be our own parties, ones across the aisle, and just kind of focus on the things that we knew affected us, because I think we don't see a lot of young voices in policy. We don't have, you know, we have quite, I guess, generalised approaches to talking about policy, and like, you know, it's about the wider population rather than groups like young people who are on a whole quite disadvantaged. And so we felt it was really important for us to put together something that spoke to what we wanted to see. And again, it really links to so much of the stuff we talked to tonight. Yeah, we talked about universal student allowances, understudy, raises to benefits and changes to WINS sanctions and other things, raises to minimum wage, rent-to-own schemes for housing, increasing state homes, and also things like free public transport. So yeah, just really trying to take like a holistic view of like this mental health kind of crisis, and again, like not like obviously we need support wraparound services for the individual, but we need to kind of look at these wider contexts of the environment that people are living in that's causing them to be in such distress in the first place. Yeah.
Thank you. That was, I think, was a really good nutshell of that policy. So cheers for that. Thank you so much, Kate. So our last kind of pointed question is one at Erin. So Erin, I was wondering if you could tell us what structural changes you think are needed to acknowledge New Zealand's issues with child disability poverty in New Zealand.
Just a small question, eh?
Yeah, they're huge, I know.
I guess like some ideas, but like first of all, like actually like focusing on it as an intersection would be a good start. So like at the moment, there's not actually, even in terms of data collected on it as an issue specific to disabled children, we don't actually have much data on it. Jonathan mentioned Sam Murray's CCS Disability Action, and they did a report at the end of last year using the most recent disability survey data that we do have, which is 2013, so a while ago now, and they found that disabled children are 1.4 to 1.6 times more likely to live below poverty thresholds than non-disabled children, and the caregivers of disabled children are 1.5 times more likely to report not having enough money than caregivers of non-disabled children. So it clearly is an issue, but it's one that hasn't really been focused on in any kind of systemic way, so that would be a good start, I think. And then similar to what we have talked about tonight, just in terms of raising benefit levels substantially, I think child disability allowance, raising that substantially, doubling or tripling that, and as well as core benefit levels, having a broader policy focus on education, health and social development agencies coming together to provide more comprehensive support for disabled children and their families, and also the children of disabled parents, which I think is another group that gets overlooked a lot in this conversation. And I think those ministries don't necessarily see their role as reducing poverty, but their policies and practices definitely do have an impact on the levels of poverty that people experience. So I think there definitely needs to be more of a policy focus on those specific areas. And just going back to housing, I think that's always going to be a key issue in terms of we need to substantially increase the amount of social housing we have, and we need to make sure that all of it is accessible to people. So just a few ideas.
Big question. You smashed that. That was awesome. That was more policy than last night's leaders debate. So thank you for that. That was fantastic.
Pretty low bar, but yeah.
So we have time for one more question from the crowd before we round off for the night with our last panelist question. So is there anyone in the crowd who would like to ask a question? Sure thing, mate.
So Jonathan, you were talking about like how we're in a neoliberal paradigm, right? What can we do to kind of get beyond that, right? So the reason we had Keynesianism from the 1930s to the 1960s was partly because we had the radical left as a mediator, I would argue. We haven't really had that up until now. I guess my question is, how do we shift people's minds to have that kind of collectivist view?
Right.
Because I know there's arguments that the welfare state in New Zealand was created as if I get into trouble, I'll be okay because of this, rather than a collectivist thing. But how do we create that collectivist culture in order to implement policy that will mean that we care about the most vulnerable in society?
Well, some of you may have come across a French economist called Thomas Piketty, and he has written two huge books, one of which basically pointed out that there was enormous inequality in Europe and many other parts of the world for that matter, during the 19th century. In fact, the level of inequality grew in some countries, like France, during the 19th century, notwithstanding the French Revolution. And then there was a dramatic change in income and wealth inequality during the first half of the 20th century. And then during the latter part of the 20th century and into this century, inequality has grown again. What brought about the dramatic reduction in income and wealth inequality in the first half of the 20th century? Well, sadly, the answer is 2 world wars and a Great Depression. He's now written another book, even longer, 1,000 words, which I have to be honest, I have 1,000 pages I haven't read, but I've read the reviews. And he basically tries to say, actually, we don't necessarily need to have a war in order to increase our emphasis on interdependence and solidarity and looking after each other and so on. But it's not clear to me what the alternative to war is. It might be multiple pandemics and pestilence. It might be a terrible climate crisis. Yes. I have a sense, sadly, that the period of human history we're moving into actually will result ultimately in a greater emphasis on human solidarity and so on because of the suffering we're going to witness. Yeah. But I'm sorry to say it's going to be driven by suffering rather than necessarily high ideals, so to speak. I shouldn't say too much more. I tend to be a bit of a black hat person. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean the evidence of history very quickly is it's actually very easy to make people's lives, particularly at the bottom end of the income distribution, worse off. And it's very easy to give tax cuts to the better off. It's much harder to impose tax increases on the better off and to give generous assistance to those who are most in need. The politics of it, unfortunately, doesn't seem to work. But if you're going to get the politics to work, you have to have that shift in values. What is sufficient to get that shift in values? Well, a common enemy, war, or a common enemy, maybe pandemics, or a common enemy, ecological degradation and collapse. All right.
Thank you. On that light-hearted note, we'll move to cheers for that. That was a really good discussion. I think that did touch on some very important parts and probably things that will be shaping the way that welfare looks in the future. So thank you very much for that. We have our final question for the night. Woo! Cool. Sweet. So the last question we have for all the panelists tonight is, what message would you give to someone that wants to make change in the welfare space? Erin, would you like to start?
I think just do what you can with what you have and surround yourself with good people. I think we all have times where we, especially in the types of work that we do, where we think that nothing's ever going to get better, and that particularly in an environment like this where there is so much suffering happening in the world, that it gets pretty tough sometimes. But I think as long as you kind of keep committed to whatever cause that you're most passionate about, and surround yourself with some good friends and a community that you can come home to at the end of the day and have a cup of tea and a rant to, I think that keeps me pretty grounded and keeps me going. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, similar to Erin, I think that community, right, is really important in terms of like change making and kind of advocacy and activism and whatever you're kind of working on. But I also think just like coming back to obviously individual model, but like really making sure you're in the right place to be engaging with that kind of change making work, because it is grueling and it is tiring and it is soul sucking and it can, I find sometimes that I feel really, really overwhelmed with like trying to change the world or like trying to just make things better. And so yeah, really important to make sure you are personally like working on the things that you find fulfilling, and you're working with people who lift you up and help like carry you through when it's really difficult. And I just think knowing as well that kind of whatever you are doing, you know, as long as you're kind of not in the 1% or doing, you know, oil drilling or whatever, it's a lot of the stuff we do on the daily, whether it be the degrees we take or I don't know, recycling at home or looking after someone in an aged care facility, it all matters, right? It's all, everything we do is really important because it leads back to stuff that Jonathan was talking about around community care and actually like connecting with people and learning and changing and engaging and just like, yeah, so it's all good stuff. And I just think just keep going, keep fighting, and we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, mine would be an echo as well of Kate and Erin. A lot of us who end up in mental health advocacy have mental health issues ourselves. So certainly I've learnt through, especially talking about borderline personality disorder, where a lot of people don't like us within the mental health community. It's, yeah, surround yourself with good people. I would honestly, if I had any friends who were looking to get into this, I would say find some resources on burnout. Do a Google search, look at some self-care stuff, make sure you're doing your ADLs, your activities of daily living, and you're eating your meals and you're getting your sleep. And if things are stressing you out, put it down for a day, because there's so much you're going to hear that's going to be really upsetting. And you can't help anyone else if you're not well, if you're not on top of it. Yeah.
Wow, I mean, tremendous amount of wisdom sitting over here to my left. I just fully endorse everything that's been said. All those points are terrific. You need others to help you. You need to pace yourself. You need to look after yourself. All really vital things. If I just add two other small elements, one would be, you know, it's good to have a vision of what you're working towards, but also good to focus in on specific small wins that are realistic in a way that the long-term vision may not be very realistic. It's sort of more idealistic, but select some small wins or things that you hope you can get and that will contribute to the long-term vision. So, you know, and I think that applies to much of life, doesn't it, in terms of how we live our lives. Tackle the things that we feel we can actually master or achieve, which hopefully are part of a broader life plan. I just say it's been a privilege to be part of this discussion. If this is played, I probably won't ever be employed by the National Party again.
We won't hold it against you. It's fine.
But that's life. But that's life. I'm old now. I can say what I want.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for what you've said tonight. I'd like to echo Jonathan that there is a tremendous amount of wisdom over here to my left. So thank you so much for coming. I'd like to acknowledge how you've all come here and shared some very personal experiences and some very personal stories with us and beliefs. And I think that takes a lot. And I'm very, very proud that we've managed to bring together an amazing group of panelists. So could everyone please put your hands together for this group to my left? Also, thank you so much to everyone who's come along tonight. It's awesome to see all your faces here. There's so many of them. And also, thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in. It's been an absolutely amazing experience. My last piece of thanks goes to Grace, our lovely engagement vice president, who helped set up this event, and also to Alice and Sophie from the DSA. Thank you so much. Alice helped put together these amazing slides that have just been radicalizing you as you've watched. So thank you so much to her as well for that. But yes, with that, we'd like to sign out from the panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I hope you've really learned something, because I know I sure have. Cheers. Ka kite. Take care. Thank you.
And can I just say, I've got a car and I live in Mount Cook, so if anybody needs a ride, you're welcome. You'll be very welcome.